In just 43 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved morning hosts turned a simple conversation into an absolute car crash that ended with Hollywood royalty storming off set. What started as light banter about Pierce Brosnan's latest film spiraled into a vicious attack on his personal life, his family, and his integrity. The cameras captured every brutal second as Lorraine Kelly crossed lines that should never be crossed, pushing the James Bond legend to his absolute breaking point until he had no choice but to walk away from the chaos she created. Before we dive into this absolute mess, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals, the confrontations the networks don't want you to see, and the moments that reveal who these people really are behind their polished public images. Last night's episode of Lorraine was supposed to be a celebration. Pierce Brosnan, the man who defined James Bond for a generation, was on the show to talk about his environmental documentary and his new production company's focus on climate change stories. He walked onto that bright orange sofa with his trademark charm, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, flashing that smile that's melted hearts for decades. The studio audience clapped warmly. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed fine. Lorraine greeted him with her usual Scottish cheerfulness, the kind that's made her a daytime television staple for years. They shook hands. He sat down. The first few minutes were exactly what you'd expect. She asked him about the documentary, about traveling to remote locations, about what inspired him to focus on environmental issues at this stage of his career. Pierce answered thoughtfully, passionately even, talking about his responsibility as someone with a platform to speak about the climate crisis. He mentioned his children, how he wanted to leave them a world worth living in. It was all very wholesome, very safe. Then Lorraine shifted gears. You could see it in her eyes, that glint that regular viewers know all too well. That moment when she decides she's going to dig deeper, push harder, go for something more than the surface-level chat. She leaned forward slightly, her smile still plastered on, but her tone changed. Now, Pierce, you talk about your children and the world you want to leave them. But there's been quite a lot of talk recently about your lifestyle, hasn't it? She said, her voice dripping with false concern. Private jets, multiple properties around the world. That massive yacht you were photographed on in the Mediterranean? Some people might say there's a bit of hypocrisy there, no? The studio went quiet. You could feel the temperature drop. Pierce's smile faded slightly, but he kept his composure. He's a professional, after all. He's dealt with difficult questions before. Well, Lorraine, I think that's a fairly reductive way to look at it, he replied, his Irish accent becoming slightly more pronounced, which happens when he's choosing his words carefully. Yes, I've been fortunate in my career. I own properties. I travel for work. But the documentary addresses systemic issues, corporate responsibility, government policy. It's not about individual carbon footprints. It's about the massive industrial polluters who are destroying our planet while pointing fingers at ordinary people. It was a solid answer. Reasonable. Intelligent. Most hosts would have nodded, moved on, maybe asked a follow-up about the solutions presented in the documentary. But not Lorraine. Not last night. But surely, you can see how it looks, Pierce, she pressed, that smile never leaving her face even as her words got sharper. You're asking working-class families to make sacrifices, to worry about their carbon footprint, while you're flying around on private jets. It's a bit rich, isn't it? Telling people to do better while you live in absolute luxury? Pierce shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened slightly. I'm not telling anyone to make sacrifices I'm not willing to make myself, he said, his voice still controlled but with an edge creeping in. The film isn't about individual blame. It's about holding massive corporations accountable. It's about policy change. I find it interesting that you're more concerned about my travel arrangements than the oil companies pumping millions of tons of pollutants into the atmosphere every single day, the audience murmured. Some people clapped. You could tell they were on his side. But Lorraine wasn't backing down. If anything, she was enjoying this. She does this sometimes. Gets a bit of controversy going. Creates a moment that'll get clipped and shared on social media. But she was playing with fire, and she didn't seem to realize it. I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking, Lorraine continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that makes your skin crawl. It's all well and good for celebrities to lecture us about the environment, but when you're living that lifestyle, when you're part of the problem, it rings a bit hollow, doesn't it? Pierce took a deep breath. You could see him counting to 10 in his head, trying to keep his temper in check. I came here to talk about a documentary that took 3 years to make, that highlights real solutions to the climate crisis, that features scientists and activists doing incredible work, he said slowly, deliberately. I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm trying to amplify voices that deserve to be heard. But if you'd rather focus on tabloid talking points about my personal life, then perhaps we should just end this conversation now. It was a warning. A clear, unmistakable warning. Any sensible host would have heard it, would have pulled back, steered the conversation somewhere safer. But Lorraine Kelly isn't always sensible when she thinks she's onto something. She laughed, actually laughed, like he'd made a joke. "Oh, come on, Pierce, don't be so sensitive," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "This is morning television. People want to know about the real you, not just the polished Hollywood version. And speaking of your personal life, there's been some rumors lately about trouble in paradise, haven't there? How's everything at home?" That's when the atmosphere completely changed. Pierce's entire demeanor shifted. His eyes went cold. The famous charm vanished instantly, replaced by genuine anger. "Excuse me?" he said quietly, dangerously quietly. Lorraine either didn't notice or didn't care about the warning signs. She barreled ahead, clearly thinking she was onto some gossip gold. "Well, there's been stories in the papers, haven't there? Sources saying you and your wife have been spending a lot of time apart, that there's been arguments. Is there any truth to those rumors? Are things rocky between you two?" The studio audience gasped. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed to freeze. You don't go there. You just don't. There are lines in interviewing, boundaries that professionals respect, and Lorraine had just crashed through all of them like they didn't exist. Pierce stood up. Not quickly, not in a theatrical way. He stood up slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled despite the fury that was clearly building inside him. "Are you actually serious right now?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "Are you genuinely asking me about my marriage based on tabloid rumors?" Lorraine looked taken aback for half a second, but then that professional mask slipped back into place. "It's just a question, Pierce. If there's nothing to it, you can just say so, and we can move on." "Just a question?" Pierce repeated, his voice rising now. "You ambush me with attacks on my integrity, dismiss the work I'm trying to do, and then you have the audacity to bring up my wife, my marriage, based on lies printed in gossip rags. What the hell is wrong with you?" The swearing caught everyone off guard. Pierce Brosnan doesn't swear on morning television. Pierce Brosnan is charm and class and sophistication. But Lorraine had pushed him beyond his breaking point, and the mask was off. "There's no need for that language," Lorraine said, her voice sharp now, the friendly Scottish warmth completely gone. "I'm just doing my job. If you can't handle basic questions about your life, then maybe you shouldn't be putting yourself in the public eye." That was it. That was the moment of no return. Pierce Brosnan stared at her with an expression of pure disgust. "Basic questions?" he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You call attacking my work, my values, and my family basic questions? This isn't journalism, Lorraine. This is tabloid trash dressed up as morning television. And I'm not going to sit here and let you disrespect me and the people I love for ratings." Lorraine stood up too now, clearly not expecting the conversation to spiral this far out of control, but too proud or too stubborn to back down. "I think you're overreacting," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that makes everything worse. "This is what interviews are. If you can't handle a little pushback, then maybe you're not as tough as James Bond after all." The audience audibly groaned at that. It was such a cheap shot, such a pathetic attempt at a jab, and it landed exactly as badly as you'd expect. Pierce actually laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was bitter and angry and done. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "Bringing up Bond. How original. How devastatingly clever. You know what, Lorraine? I've done hundreds of interviews over the years. Thousands, probably. I've dealt with tough questions, hard conversations, real journalism. But this is just sad. You had a chance to have a real conversation about something that matters, about the climate crisis, about the documentary, about work that could actually make a difference. But instead, you chose to be petty, to chase gossip, to try and tear me down for no reason other than it might get you a few extra clicks online. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by you. Lorraine shot back, her face flushing red now, her composure cracking. This is my show, my set. If you don't like my questions, then you can leave. Oh, I'm going to leave, Pierce said, reaching down to unclip his microphone. Don't you worry about that. But before I do, let me make something very clear. You don't get to ambush guests with lies about their personal lives and call it journalism. You don't get to attack someone's integrity and then act surprised when they defend themselves. And you certainly don't get to drag someone's family into your petty attempts at creating controversy. He yanked the microphone off, not gently, and tossed it onto the sofa. The sound tech somewhere off camera probably winced at the rough treatment of the equipment, but nobody said anything. The entire studio was frozen, watching this car crash unfold in real time. Lorraine's face was bright red now, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "You're being completely unprofessional," she said, her voice rising. "Walking off set in the middle of an interview. This is live television, Pierce. You can't just throw a tantrum and leave." "A tantrum?" Pierce repeated, his voice full of disbelief. "You think this is a tantrum? This is me having enough self-respect to not sit here and be your punching bag. You want to talk about unprofessional? Look in a mirror. You brought me here under false pretenses, pretended this would be about the documentary, about the work, and then you turned it into a hit job. That's unprofessional. That's dishonest. And I'm not going to be part of it." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of this absolute disaster. You could see the producers in the background, probably panicking, trying to figure out how to handle this. Cut to commercial? Let it play out? There was no good option at this point. The damage was done. "I think we need to take a break," Lorraine said, trying to regain some control of the situation, trying to salvage something from this mess. But Pierce wasn't interested in giving her an easy out. "No, we don't need to take a break," he said firmly. "What we need is for you to understand that you crossed a line today. Multiple lines, actually. You don't know anything about my marriage except what you read in tabloids written by people who make things up for a living. You don't know anything about my environmental work except what you decided to criticize without actually watching the documentary. You came into this with an agenda, and that agenda was to create drama at my expense." Lorraine's professionalism was completely gone now. Her mask had slipped entirely, revealing the pettiness underneath. "Maybe if you weren't so defensive, there wouldn't be any drama," she snapped. "Maybe if you actually lived the values you claim to have, people wouldn't question your sincerity." The audience actually booed at that. Booed. On morning television. It was unprecedented. People in the studio audience, who had come expecting a nice chat with a beloved movie star, were booing the host of the show. That's how badly Lorraine had misread the room. Pierce smiled grimly at the sound. "There it is," he said. "There's your real opinion. You know what's fascinating, Lorraine? I've been in this industry for over 40 years. I've worked with some incredible people and some terrible people. I've seen professionalism, and I've seen pettiness. And what you've shown me today is pure pettiness. You're not interested in having a conversation. You're interested in tearing someone down because you think it makes you look clever or tough or interesting. But all it does is make you look small." "Get off my set," Lorraine said, her voice shaking with anger now. "If you're going to insult me, you can get off my set right now." "I'm already leaving," Pierce said calmly, though his eyes were still blazing with anger. "But let me leave you with this. When people watch this back, when they see how this unfolded, they're not going to see me overreacting. They're going to see a host who attacked a guest for no reason, who brought up his family based on tabloid lies, who turned what should have been a positive conversation about important issues into a circus. And that's on you, Lorraine. That's entirely on you." He turned to walk off the set, but Lorraine couldn't let him have the last word. "You're just upset because someone finally called out your hypocrisy," she called after him. "You can't handle the truth." Pierce stopped. For a second, it looked like he might turn around, might engage again, might drag this out even further. But then he shook his head, clearly deciding she wasn't worth any more of his time or energy. "The truth?" he said without turning around. "The truth is, You're a bully hiding behind a microphone and a friendly persona. The truth is, you ambushed me, attacked my family, and now you're trying to make yourself the victim. The truth is, everyone in this studio, everyone watching at home, can see exactly what happened here today. And it's not me who should be embarrassed." And with that, he walked off. Just walked straight off the set while Lorraine stood there, her face red, her hands shaking slightly with anger, or adrenaline, or both. The cameras caught all of it. His straight-backed, dignified exit. Her standing there, clearly not knowing what to do or say next. The audience sitting in stunned silence, some of them still shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. "Well," Lorraine finally said, trying to compose herself, trying to salvage something from this absolute catastrophe. "That was unexpected. Pierce Brosnan, everyone, walking off the show because he didn't like being asked legitimate questions about his lifestyle and choices." But her voice was shaking. Her hands were trembling as she clutched her cue cards. And the audience wasn't buying it. Not even a little bit. A few people in the crowd actually got up and left themselves, clearly disgusted with how their morning television host had behaved. The camera cut to a wide shot of the studio, showing Lorraine standing alone on that bright orange set, the empty sofa beside her where Pierce Brosnan had been sitting just minutes before. The space where a Hollywood legend had been before he was driven away by questions that had nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with creating conflict for the sake of ratings. Lorraine tried to transition to the next segment, something about cooking or gardening or whatever typically harmless content fills morning television. But her voice lacked its usual energy. She looked rattled, shaken, like she was only now realizing how badly she'd messed up, how spectacularly this had backfired. Because here's the thing about pushing people too far. When you attack someone's work, their integrity, their family, you might think you're being hard-hitting or fearless or entertaining, but all you're really doing is revealing your own character. And what Lorraine revealed in those devastating minutes was someone willing to cross any line, hurt any feeling, damage any reputation if she thought it would make for good television. Pierce Brosnan came on that show to talk about climate change, to promote work he genuinely cares about, to use his platform for something meaningful. And instead, he was subjected to a personal attack disguised as an interview. He was questioned about his lifestyle by someone who clearly hadn't done the research to understand what the documentary was actually about. And worst of all, he had his marriage, his private life, his family dragged into a conversation where they had no business being mentioned. The fact that he maintained his composure for as long as he did speaks to his professionalism. Most people would have walked off much sooner. Most people would have lost their temper much more dramatically. But Pierce gave Lorraine multiple chances to pull back, to change direction, to salvage the interview. She ignored every single one of those chances. She doubled down, again and again, until there was simply no way for the conversation to continue. And now the clips are everywhere. Social media is exploding with opinions, with people taking sides, with analysis of every word exchanged in those heated minutes. But the overwhelming consensus is clear. Pierce Brosnan did nothing wrong. He defended himself, defended his work, defended his family, and when it became clear that the host had no interest in a genuine conversation, he left. That's not a tantrum. That's not being unable to handle tough questions. That's someone knowing their worth and refusing to be disrespected. Lorraine, on the other hand, has a lot of explaining to do. Her team is probably in crisis mode right now, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make it look like she wasn't completely in the wrong. But there's no spin that can change what happened. The cameras caught everything, the audience saw everything, and the verdict is in. You don't ambush guests with attacks on their personal lives. You don't bring up their families based on tabloid rumors. You don't dismiss their work without understanding it. And you certainly don't act surprised when they refuse to sit there and take it. That's not journalism. That's not entertainment. That's just cruel and unnecessary and unprofessional. As Pierce Brosnan pushed through the studio doors and disappeared into the corridor beyond, walking away from one of the most uncomfortable television moments in recent memory, one thing was crystal clear. He wasn't the one who lost control in that interview. He wasn't the one who should be ashamed of how things unfolded. He was simply a person who reached his limit of tolerance for being attacked and decided he deserved better. And he was absolutely right.